Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm Jody, your host today, and I'm speaking with Professor David Kovar from the Department of Molecular Genetics and Cell Biology. Dr. Kovar was the winner of the 2011 Biological Science Division Distinguished Educator and Mentor Award. He's published nearly 100 articles and was recently awarded the 2022 Quantrell Undergraduate Teaching Award. He's here to talk to us about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor.
Hi, my name is David Kovar. I'm a professor in the Department of Molecular Genetics and Cell Biology, and I have a joint appointment or secondary appointment in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of Chicago. My lab studies the basic functions of a cell. In particular, we're interested in how cells divide, how cells crawl, how cells polarize, et cetera. And as I said, these are just fundamental functions that a cell normally does for development of an organism or for maintenance of an organism. And in particular, we're interested in the machinery inside of a cell that actually facilitates those processes. And that machinery is something called the actin cytoskeleton. And now cytoskeleton stands for cell skeleton. And basically, I think a simple way of thinking about the cytoskeleton is it's kind of like the cell's Lego building blocks. And what's interesting is that a cell can take this pool of Lego building blocks and can assemble different structures or networks that are essentially little machines that drive these different fundamental processes. So a cell can build these Legos into a network that is in the form of a ring that physically divides a cell into two for cell division, or it can assemble these Legos into another network or machine that pushes a cell forward so that it can crawl or move along. And so what we're really interested in understanding is a general phenomenon that we call self-organization, which is to say we're interested in how you can take these same components, these same Lego building blocks, and assemble them into these entirely different structures that are organized in a particular way that facilitates these very different processes.
One of our audiences for these podcasts is students trying to figure out what they want to study. So can you talk a little bit about your own education? And did you always know you wanted to study science or become a science professor?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And so it really, when I hear that question, it really takes me back to when I was much younger, even in high school or before. So my father was a professor of chemistry at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado. And so there was definitely a period in my life when I thought I would grow up to be a chemistry professor. And I think I always thought that, or for a long period of time, but somewhere along the way in high school, I actually became more interested in a completely different endeavor, and that is the sport of soccer. And so for full honesty, I went to college primarily with the focus of playing soccer, and that's why I chose to go to Ohio Wesleyan University. While there, I also majored in chemistry, but I very quickly realized that I wasn't in love with chemistry. There was a period where I was a journalism major even. What I think is unusual is it wasn't until the second semester of my junior year that I took a molecular biology course, and this course just changed my life. This course was about things like DNA replication, how cells replicate their DNA, how cells make DNA into RNA that then translated into protein, just some fundamental biological processes. And it just blew me away. And at that point, I realized that I really wanted to be a cell biologist. And so at that point is when I really got serious about science. And I then went on to graduate school at Purdue University, which ultimately led to me with a career as a professor as a cell biologist.
So I'm curious about the actual blowing your mind thing. So was it just the basic science of it, or do you remember, did it connect with something in the real world for you in a new way?
Yeah, I guess it was really just the basic science of it. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, even as a young kid, maybe it was my dad's influence. I was always really interested in science in general, but something about just understanding how a cell works and being really excited about these underlying little molecular details, that protein A binds to protein B, which facilitates this process, it just somehow really left a deep impression on me. And I knew from that moment that this is what I wanted to study for the rest of my life. And so it really wasn't anything more exciting than just something triggered in my mind that this was the coolest thing I had ever seen.
That's an envious kind of magical moment that you had to be laser focused on something like that. So tell me a little bit about choosing Purdue as the school that you went to for your advanced studies.
Yeah, well, there's multiple reasons I ended up at Purdue. So since I didn't decide that I wanted to be a biology major until very late in the process, of course, I was a step or maybe even two steps behind. I frantically took a lot of courses my senior year to finish up the major and so forth. And in fact, I even remember upon making the decision that I wanted to apply to graduate school to work on a PhD, I suddenly had the realization that I needed to take the GRE exam, and looked it up. And, I think it was like that coming Saturday was the last Saturday you could take the exam before applications were due. And I actually had to drive like 2 hours away and sit there on a wait list. Luckily, someone didn't show up and I got to go in and take this exam. So I was really behind in the whole process, and there weren't so many places that I was able to apply to. And Purdue University was just a wonderful fit for me. I was very lucky that I got in there, I think, in retrospect. And it was still close to Ohio, and there was a significant other that was still back at my school in Ohio. So I didn't want to leave too far from Ohio at the time either.
Was there a mentor or somebody who was helping you through that process of deciding where to go? And
yeah, that's a really good question. Many years later, looking back on it, so Ohio Wesleyan is a small liberal arts school. I think 2,000-ish students, and I think I was very fortunate to be at a small liberal arts school because the classes were small, and you got to know your professors very well, and so it was a professor there who basically really encouraged me and gave me the confidence that even though it was very late in the game, that I should still, try to go to grad school at that point. So that was a big moment. And then on top of that, I think the mentor that I had at Purdue University, my PhD research advisor, Chris Steiger, he really made all the difference as well. And I think one of the best decisions I ever made was picking a laboratory to do my research, not actually based on the research subject, but more so on the advisor. And what I mean by that is picking the advisor that I thought would be the best to teach me and train me how to be the best scientist possible. I think that was a really important decision in my life.
So can you say a little bit more about that for somebody who might be listening and like right now they're in the process of trying to pick an advisor or a mentor? Tell us a little bit more about, what did you say the person's name was? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it was Professor Chris Steiger, who is a professor of biology, plant biology at Purdue University. So before I go into that, because I think your question is really important, is I should also say that as a professor here at the University of Chicago, I have been heavily involved in graduate education my entire time here. And in fact, that has expanded into a leadership role whereby for multiple years, I was chair of a graduate program here at the University of Chicago. And in fact, in the last 6 or so months, I've now been dean for graduate affairs in the biological science division. And so this question you're asking me, which is how do you choose an academic advisor, is a question that I get all the time. And it's a question that I think is really important. Okay, so the answer when people ask, how do you choose an advisor? I think, of course, there's no one size fits all. But I think one thing that most students do is they think very carefully about the subject. So they think about, well, what is the science I'm most interested in? What particular subject do I want to study? And I agree, that's really important. You have to join a laboratory or an area of research that really excites you, because that's what gets you up in the morning. But I think what is sometimes overlooked, or even often overlooked, is this idea that in addition to the science, you're joining a laboratory, you're joining a professor who's running that laboratory, and you're also, of course, joining essentially a family, or even I often think of it as a sports team where, there are other graduate students, there are postdocs, there are technicians. It's a group of people that you're joining, and you'll be working with them for the next 4, 5, 6 years. And so I was very fortuitous, and a senior student, when I started graduate school at Purdue, pulled me aside and told me the importance of making sure when you're picking a lab to think carefully also about the environment, the trainer, et cetera. And so Chris Steiger was a fairly new professor early in his career, and he had a lot of energy, and it was very clear that this would be someone that would really be vested in my development as a scientist and really go put a lot of effort into training me into how to be a good scientist. And so I think that that's really important to think not only about the subject that you're going to study, but also the environment that you'll be in. And again, I just want to reiterate that there's no right or wrong answer to the environment. What might be the best environment for one student may not be the best environment for another student. So you just really need to figure out what you think is the environment that will be best suited for your development, and think carefully about that when making your decision on which lab to join.
That sounds like really great advice. I hope people are taking notes as they're listening here. So what do you think makes a great scientist? You've mentioned that a couple times now.
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of attributes. I think being inquisitive, being curious, I think is the most thing, always asking, well, why does it work this way? I think creativity is really important. There's a lot of wonderful scientists out there, but those that I think that have stood out in my life are those that are particularly creative. And I think creative can mean, more than one thing. I think creative can mean identifying interesting questions that maybe others don't see. Creative can also be thinking of interesting ways to solve or investigate a problem you're interested in. So those are really important. I think learning how to be organized, which I think is just a general trait that is common to successful people in whatever career you might have. And then I think more than anything, just being passionate. That is really key to success in anything you do in life. If you're passionate about it, I think that you'll therefore put in the effort you need to be successful, because it's not work at that point. It's fun. It's what you enjoy doing. And so I think passion is a key to success in almost anything one might do.
So I do want to ask you about how these things like creativity and passion and your mentoring shows up in your own Kovar Lab. But before we get to that, aside from Dr. Steiger, are there other mentors or great cheerleaders you've had in your professional life? Helped you along the way?
Good question. So it's kind of a long-winded process to get to the point where you're a professor at a university. So of course you're an undergrad, and I had advisors there, as I mentioned, who were important. Then you go to graduate school where you earn your PhD, and Chris Steiger was my mentor there. But then after that, you go off and do what is called a postdoc, which is where, again, you spend 3, 4, 5 years under being advised by another researcher who helps sculpt your career. And for that was Tom Pollard at Yale University, and he was really instrumental in my development as well. So, whereas I think often when you're earning your PhD, your advisor is often very hands-on. Actually, I spoke with Professor Steiger, every day at Purdue University about what experiments I was doing, how to do the experiments, how to think about interpreting them, and so forth. Well, when you transition to your postdoc, it's really important to become even more independent, where you're given the freedom to really, follow your own instincts, to really start to think about things yourself. And Tom Pollard was wonderful in creating an environment where there was structure and camaraderie and teamwork, but also really allowed a lot of independence, which I think is really critical, because that's what you need when you go start your own lab. Is you have to be independent, right? You have to really not only be thinking of what are the important questions to go after and the ones that are actually experimentally tractable, but then also how to advise new students and new postdocs to work in that area. And then even here at the University of Chicago, when you start your position, you're a young new assistant professor and you have somewhat no idea what you're doing, and you're given an empty lab and you have to buy equipment and you have to recruit people to your lab and train them. And so I had a lot of wonderful senior colleagues who gave me plenty of advice about how to set up a lab, how to properly pick people to come to your lab, how to help train people, and so forth. And so, I think the overarching message, which was kind of implied by your question, is, yeah, you need people to advise you all the way along. I've been here almost 20 years now, and I still go to senior colleagues for advice when certain questions come up. I think you should never stop taking advice. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that never being afraid to ask questions is like a message you can't give to students too many times of any age.
I agree, and
Yeah.
you should never be afraid to say you don't know something and that you need help. I think it's
Right.
really important.
Yeah. Yeah. So this seems like a great segue to talk about your lab now and what you're doing with your team. So Kovar Lab is your current lab. Was that your first lab or?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Kovar Lab just simply means that, it's my last name. I started here in 2005 as an assistant professor. And as I said, you have this empty lab. And then you slowly build, you buy equipment and then you recruit graduate students, you hire a technician, you hopefully recruit postdocs, and then you just start addressing whatever question, that you're interested in. And then you just build up over time.
And so you're circling around questions related to the same small subject area that you're interested in terms of cells and how they operate and how they structure themselves. Have you been pretty much on the same thing for all these years since 2005, or does the subject kind of switch a bit? And is that determined by your interests, the people who are working with you? How do you all decide what you're working on at any given time?
Yeah, so I think there's different strategies, but when I started my lab, I basically continued the line of research that I had done as a postdoc and then started that here. And I would say the biggest change over the years has been how the focus. And what I mean by that is I was very narrowly focused, I think, at first. And I think that was probably the right decision to make, because you have, fewer people and you only have a certain amount of time to get work done before you come up for tenure. And so I was very focused. And so what I would say the big change over time has been is that I've really broadened my areas of interest. And so I think to an outsider, it would look like, oh, these are all the same questions we've been studying for the last almost 20 years. But, we've really, branched out. So, for example, to try to put this in terms of the Legos that I was talking about earlier, when I started my lab, I was really focused on one particular network in a cell at a time. And we were really interested in just particular Lego blocks and how they fit into the puzzle. And then over time, what we've done is expanded to think about not one particular Lego block or one particular network built by Legos, but to think about all of them at the same time in a cell. And that's why we think about this idea of self-organization. So we've really expanded that. And then your question about how you think about projects, when I started my lab, I think it largely came from me and what I was thinking was important. But I think the fun part of running a lab is you very quickly realize that the people you recruit to your lab are just incredibly smart. They have their own interests and their own passions. And so basically you can follow their interests because you build this lab with students and postdocs that come in with different expertise themselves, their own unique ideas. And so really we can just kind of follow what they're doing. And so I've had just a few or many brilliant students and postdocs, but there have been particular students and postdocs that have kind of brought in their ideas that were just phenomenal that the whole lab has followed over the years. I would say that another major change that has occurred slowly over the last 20 years is the collaborative nature of the work that my lab does. So I think in the early days, the work we did was really focused within our own lab, whereas over the last 20 years and even really currently is that most of the work we do is highly collaborative, meaning that everyone in my lab's projects often are heavily influenced or involved with other labs, either here at the University of Chicago or outside the university. And in fact, many of the people in my lab, their project is really joint between my lab and neighboring labs here at the university. And that's really, really exciting because we only have certain expertises, whereas other labs have their own expertises. And so by bringing two labs together, you can do science that you wouldn't have been able to do on your own.
Sounds really exciting. I'm jealous that I didn't go into science and get to be part of one of these teams, or, you described it as a family earlier. And as I was poking around your website, excited to look at the different outings that your team went on. And I saw you're eating a lot of fancy cakes together and going to a lot of fun looking places and doing things together. So it seems you're able to also balance that, the work and having a good time with one another.
Yes, that's a big part of it, right? I mean, yeah, we are a family. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And in fact, one thing I'd like to add about that aspect of it is, so personally, when you transition from being the one who does all the science themselves, right? So as a postdoc, I'm the one in there who was doing the experiments and making certain discoveries, which I felt were really exciting. But then when you start your own lab, over the years, you slowly transition from doing the work yourself to sort of becoming a full advisor. And so, in fact, I don't, some of my colleagues still get in the lab and do work, but I personally just don't have the time anymore to do work myself. But one thing you learn very quickly is, I guess it's kind of like being a parent in some senses, that the excitement that I get out of someone in my lab making a really exciting discovery is way beyond the excitement that I got, or at least I remember feeling when I made the discoveries myself. There's just something about someone who's in your team or, in your family who succeeds and has this just amazing euphoric moment that is really exciting, even more exciting, as I mentioned, than I remember it feeling like when I myself was the one who did a particular experiment that yielded a really cool and novel result.
It sounds like the response of a science professor, like somebody who really wants to have that mentoring and teaching aspect to their career, which is interesting because one of the final questions I had for you was, did you ever consider working as a scientist in another capacity?
Yeah, so a simple answer is no. I mean, many people go into industry or publications or there's, lots of fields now that PhD scientists go to, but I always wanted to be a professor. And I think part of that is simply because even in early days as a PhD student where I had a chance to be a TA, I knew that in addition to research, I had a massive passion for teaching. I've always loved teaching. I really enjoy getting in the classroom. And I think that the main goal when you teach is to try to inspire your students to get excited about the subject you're teaching. And that's really been important to me. And so that's been an important aspect of my career. And I would never want to give that part up.
Yeah, I mean, listening to you talk about your work, it's hard to imagine you doing anything else. So it sounds like you're in the right place. So do you have any advice for young science scholars? Sounds like you're in the habit of giving out that kind of advice. And I know we talked before about picking a mentor, but is there any other kind of general advice you'd have for somebody thinking about going into molecular genetics or cell biology?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's endless advice one could give, from minutia all the way up to maybe big picture stuff. I think again, which I said earlier, it's really about passion. I think if I look back at my own career, I think while maybe I couldn't have controlled this, I mentioned that I didn't get interested in cell biology till very late in undergrad. Of course, if I had to do it again, I would have gotten interested earlier because I think there were key courses that I didn't take as an undergrad, such as in physics and developmental biology that would have been important. So if I had to do it again, I would have taken as many courses as possible that were in the rough area that I'm interested. And in fact, I would go even farther to say that if I had to do it again, I might have actually been a physics major, because I think physicists have all the really cool tools and quantitative abilities that are just so critical in today's science world. But it's not important really where you come from. Meaning, I think it's really critical when we have our labs to have people that have come from different backgrounds with different interests, because it's really the collective group with diverse approaches and backgrounds, which is just that's where the magic happens, when you have people from different experiences come together.
We started this conversation with me telling you that I'm a humanities person and don't know a lot about science. I have learned a lot about how a science lab works and what it's like to be a science professor. If you could, what's something that you wish non-science, non-academics like me knew about your work? What do you think is important for like everyday people to know about your area of expertise?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, so when I have non-scientists ask me about what I do, I talk about Legos and cells and so forth. I think one common response that I get is the assumption that everything we're doing is trying to solve a disease, find a cure for a disease, et cetera. And I think what's really important is, so someone like me is what I think for years has been called a basic scientist. I think I would prefer the term fundamental scientist. But basically what me and others like me are trying to do is just understand the basic principles and mechanisms by which a normal, healthy cell functions. And the idea is that if you can understand how a normal cell works, then we presumably can figure out what goes wrong in a disease state or, cancer, et cetera. And so I think what's critical, I think, for the general public to understand is that a lot of the great discoveries that have been made have come out of scientists just trying to understand how a normal cell works. I think in that, I think a big message that I would like to pass along.
Thank you for your time today, Professor Kovar. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the other ones. Leave us a comment, subscribe, follow, and share this episode with your friends and family. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. Stay tuned for more. See you around.